Queen there, with the musical reminder that we are back to questions about bigness and smallness, specifically about the manner in which height matters. And my next guest provocatively begins her book on the topic with a simple question addressed to you. Would you like to be taller? And that book is called Short-Changed, Height Discrimination and Strategies for Social Change, and its author, who now joins me on the line from Atlanta, Georgia, is attorney Tanya S. Osensky. Tanya, I suppose that question really is rhetorical. Almost everybody would like to be taller, wouldn't they?
I believe so. Everybody that I've spoken to relishes, who is tall, relishes their height. I have not met anybody who said they would wish they were shorter. And people generally tend to even embellish what their height is when you ask them what it is. So I think that speaks to how we all wish we could be a little bit taller.
They make themselves taller, you mean? They add a couple of inches.
Very often they do, especially if they feel a little bit less than average that day.
Now, you want to say that discrimination towards short people in our society is as common as racial or gender discrimination, really picking up from what we were hearing before from Lynn, that it goes unrecognised. Why unrecognised?
I think it's mainly unrecognized because when we think about it logically, when we put on our thinking hats, we think that height is irrelevant. We think it should be irrelevant. We think it doesn't matter. And as Lynn pointed out, it is everywhere, and it actually matters a lot to all of us. And it's a strange thing because we don't acknowledge it, but it is there all the time, and we think about it all the time. But we would prefer not to. So,
I mean, taller people, just generally, you talk about, tend to be viewed as superior and stronger. And you talk about the problem being exacerbated because short people themselves actually make fun of their own height.
And that happens very often, especially in movies and TV shows where short characters and short actors are very often portrayed in a negative way, as foolish and as ridiculous. And unfortunately, I think that issue has fueled prejudice in our society overall, because it kind of points to the fact that, all of this negativity in the media and movies and TV says to people that this is okay. This is how short people deserve to be treated. This is how they expect to be treated. And so people just kind of assume that. And it turns into a lot of disrespect towards short people.
You use the term to describe discrimination as heightism. I can hear some sort of people hearing that word thinking, oh, not another ism that we've got to avoid. But let's just sort of relate, because you were moved to write this book from a personal experience of being a victim of this particular prejudice. Tell me about what happened to you.
Well, I am a short woman, and I've always been the shortest person my whole life. And my experience has been that I have been treated as someone who is not very important, I guess you could say. I've been underestimated wherever I go. And I never really thought about it as discrimination my whole life. But when I grew up and had my children, who are both boys, and they happen to also be very short, that experience of being their mother and having to watch them being underestimated all the time and treated as disrespectful as they've been treated made me very angry. And when I started to look for resources and information about this issue, I didn't find any. And that's what caused me to go out and try to raise awareness of this issue myself.
Yeah, I mean, it's always interesting you write about, you're a corporate attorney and you have been one for 20 years, but you say how it took you longer than your classmates to persuade someone to actually hire you for your first attorney job. And then, as it were, you tell me you move on from yourself to talk in general about how people's earnings and achievements are generally affected by their height. Just give me a few statistics here that you've come across.
Sure. And I did that because whenever you say, I've been discriminated against because of X, Y, Z, people will say, well, no, you have all of these other faults, and none of us is perfect. So I wanted to talk about statistics, and actual labor data show that shorter people are much less likely to be hired, much less likely to be promoted in the workplace, and they also make significantly less money than taller people. At one set of data showed that the premium for height is over $2,000 per inch for men and $1,000 per inch for women. And over time, that disparity grows significantly. So it ends up being a huge chunk of someone's paycheck over their career.
And as you point out, there's no way in which those people who are short can, as it were, they can tackle workplace height discrimination. It's not a discrimination that's recommended, that's recognised. I mean, you talk about it actually, heightism in the workplace, even more blatant in some other countries in the world.
It's true. There are many countries around the world where height requirements are blatant. And there are many Asian countries specifically which often state that a particular height is required for jobs that you would never think height is important. For example, a cashier in a restaurant or a cleaning person for a hotel. And those requirements are often higher than the average height of the people in that country.
Yeah, it's interesting, that average height, isn't it? Because, I mean, you've looked at the sort of average height. I mean, I'm interested to see black Americans on average half an inch taller than whites, Hispanic and Mexican Americans an inch or more shorter than whites. And this, yes. Even in some of the first world countries, average heights are much shorter than those in the States. So there's this bias towards height can be found everywhere.
It is everywhere, and it's very cultural. For example, here in the United States, and I believe in England as well, there's a certain sense in the country that the average is 5'10" for men and 5'4" for women, and so we set up our cultural perceptions around that. But it's obviously a lot more varied than that, and there are other cultures within our countries who have a different average height, and obviously there are many other countries where the average height is very different. So I am 4'10". I would be considered average if I lived in the Philippines, for example, but here I am considered extremely short.
You got me started on my own research around the department, because when you're talking about romance and about the importance of height and balancing height, you know, I go to sort of people in the department and say, would you go out with someone who was 3 inches smaller than you, you know, to a woman? Would you? Well, no, I don't think so. What, 2 inches smaller? Well, I don't think so. You know, that idea that the man should be taller than the woman. I found myself the other night watching a piece of news in which suddenly Rupert Murdoch appeared and so on, and he was with Jerry Hall, and the news, which was important, completely sort of disappeared because one had to talk about the respective differences between their sizes and their height.
It's very interesting that both genders, both men and women, have a very, very strong preference in a romantic relationship where the woman must be smaller than the men. And it's a preference on both parts, but it certainly makes it very difficult for men who are short in the dating world.
And men who are short are talked about. Everybody talked about Al Pacino and Dustin Hoffman, Tom Cruise and other people being short. I mean, when I was a kid, we used to say that Alan Ladd, a star at the time, had to stand on a box in order to be filmed. You know, we were fascinated by that. Here were some men who were quite small. But let me switch away from that for a moment about the idea of doing something about it, because I understand that the use of growth hormone therapy is becoming fairly widespread in the States.
It's become very widespread since the FDA approved it for children who do not have a growth hormone deficiency. It used to be that it would only be used for medical situations to correct an actual deficiency in the hormone. But as soon as the FDA approved it for use generally, people have started putting very, very young children, some as young as 5 years old, on growth hormone therapy in an effort to try to make them taller. And of course, that just medicalizes an issue that is really just a social prejudice, and it's very, very
So it is very much like whitening one's skin, really. That is almost the equivalent, isn't it? Almost condoning the prejudice. You also
it is quite immoral.
Yeah, and you talk about the limb lengthening surgery as well. That sounds even worse.
It's macabre, really. It's similar to a medieval torture technique where people have subjected themselves to a surgeon separating their leg bones and then waiting for them to grow back in a taller, so that they can be a little bit taller. It's really scary, but people feel so desperate and so depressed from all of the negativity that they experience from being short that some have really resorted to doing something that extreme.
Okay, Tanya, thank you for the moment, but please stay on the line because I've got something I just want to ask you in a moment.